Hey YouTube, what's up? Mike the Manic Geek here. And today we're going to be taking a look at a new case from Rosewill. This is called the Tyrfing. Odd as the name is, the rest of the case is actually pretty solid, but at $50, did they cut corners in the right places? And are they giving you a compelling enough reason to cheap out on your case? Well, the only way we're going to answer that is if we go ahead and take a look at it. So let's go ahead and do that. So as far as the outside of the case goes, you have a pretty Spartan exterior. I would call the styling more corporate chic more than anything else, with nice clean front fascia. And even though there isn't any open gaps in the face of the case, there is ample ventilation along the sides here. Front I/O is fairly typical fare with only a single USB 3 port in the top. Would have liked to have seen at least two USB 3s and ditch the USB 2s entirely, but it's a more budget-oriented case, so I can forgive that in this instance. The sheet metal on the outside is, well, it's $50 case sheet metal. It does flex and bow a little bit, but a lot of the rigidity for this case comes from the side panels, which do have the indentations on both sides of the case. And when I tried to flex them, there really isn't a lot of flex in these side panels. And with them on, you're really hard pressed to get this thing to budge much at all. I wouldn't trust shipping this case anywhere, but if you're going to cart it somewhere yourself or just use it for your stationary build, your rig's going to be fine in here. As far as actual air moving accommodations go, you got room for up to 220mm fans in the front or a single 140 if you want. You have a 120 in the rear and three 120s in the roof, with room for an all-in-one water cooler up here up to 360mm in length. So you'd be able to use something like a deep cool or thermal take water cooler up here and be fine. I did attempt to fit some custom water cooling hardware up here, but I noticed that if your radiator is much thicker than roughly 27 to 28mm, then it's going to collide with your memory, and that's not going to be good for the memory or the radiator that you're mounting up there. So you're going to unfortunately be stuck with all-in-ones here, but it's a $50 case that can accommodate all-in-one water coolers. I don't see really many other cases in this price bracket doing that at all. So huge thumbs up to Rosewill for at least providing us with that accommodation here. Now the dust filtering on this case was a little bit of a weird one. You do have this dust filter in the rear for the power supply, and it's made of this really nice mesh material. It's actually very soft to touch too. This I really liked. But the rest of the dust filtering comes at stock in the roof here. Now, inherently that wouldn't be such a bad thing, but there's no dust filtering in the front of the case as a result, and that's where all your intake's going to be coming from. A little bit of an oversight on Rosewill's part, I feel, but if you're industrious enough, this is something that you could easily fix yourself. Just trim this dust filter down to size, move it to the front, Bob's your uncle, you now have dust filtering on your case. Now once we get to the interior of the case, it's a fairly Spartan layout. There's nothing really huge to write home about here, and that's a good thing in this case, because normally when you're dealing with budget cases, you got an interior that's got kind of an awkward layout. There aren't really proper cable routing accommodations, but that's not the case here. Now the one oddity is the 3 optical drive bays here, when you only have access to 2 on the outside. The reason they did that is because they also supply you with a removable bracket in here so that you can hold an extra hard drive in the event that you need it. Now, one thing that I really like about the optical drive bay area is that there is a cable routing hole for the front I/O cables that are attached to the faceplate here. Yes, front I/O is attached, so when you remove the front panel, it is going to come off with that. But the fact that there's dedicated cable routing up front here means that you're going to have a much cleaner looking interior, and ultimately it makes it easier for you to pull the front panel off in the event that you need to get to something in here without disrupting the cables still. So again, really nice thought here, especially on a lower cost case like this. I'd like to see more cases incorporating something like that in the future. Now, as far as supplied fans go in this case, you get 220mm fans, one in the front and one in the rear. The one in the front can be powered by either a 3-pin fan header on your motherboard or a fan controller, or it can be powered by Molex and be run at full speed at all times. It's a neat inclusion to have here, but I feel like in certain instances this could provide some cable clutter in the back for cable management. But again, that's going to be the most difficult fan to power anyway because of its placement in the case. So having Molex power there to at least keep it powered is actually kind of a nice touch. I gotta admit, I did not expect the supplied fans in this case to be as quiet as they are, but they are actually rather quiet. I actually had a hard time filming the sound profile for them because I kept hearing the sound of the AC unit outside of our apartment over the sound of the fans. Now, once you get close to them, there is a bit of a grittiness in the bearing, and I don't know exactly how long these fans will wind up lasting in this case. But as a $50 chassis goes, I am actually very impressed with the supplied fans here, and they provide ample airflow. Right on up to about the first third of the motherboard was where I was feeling these fans move air through. So again, great job on this case, Rosewill. Now, if I had anything to gripe about, it would be just a couple little things with the supplies that come with this case. The manual that comes with it is fairly detailed, and it's got really nice walkthrough instructions for first-time system builders. But the specs listed in the back are not correct. Rosewill, I would highly recommend taking a look at the spec sheet for this again, because nowhere in the roof can you accommodate 3 140mm fans, or even a single 140mm fan for that matter. And for a first-time system builder, that could be a point of confusion for them. So just more of a clerical issue than anything else. The other issue that I had was with the supplied hardware to actually put the computer together, and that was mostly with the expansion slots at the back. They only give you one thumb screw for the expansion slots, and this is meant to be used with the single replaceable bracket that they give you for the back here. Now, you could also use this thumb screw to mount a graphics card in place, but you really should be using two for that. So I'm a little disappointed that they only give you the one thumb screw here. However, they do supply you with 4 screws for a power supply, and the threading for those screws matches the threading on your expansion slots here. So my personal recommendation, rather than using those for your power supply, use your power supply screws that come with it, because all power supplies do, and use the case's screws for your expansion cards at the back. I think that's a much cleaner implementation, and honestly, it looks a lot less gimpy to do that. Now, that being said, if you have any spare thumb screws from another case lying around, test those in here too, because I found myself able to use a couple of thumb screws from some Corsair cases that I had lying around here. So there are other options for you here. Now, once I got a build set up in here, and apologies for the graphics card not being here. I'll be doing a video shortly explaining why this card is no longer in this system, sort of. But once I got hardware built up into the case, it was actually an incredibly enjoyable building experience. The last time I built in a case that was this inexpensive, there were a lot of gripes, there were a lot of oddities in building, there were a lot of things that I had to account for that I wasn't expecting to need to account for. But that didn't happen here at all. Everything went in fairly straightforward. There was no guesswork involved with anything. I even found a little accommodation up in the back corner of the motherboard tray that I'm fairly certain wasn't meant to be used this way, but there's an opening up here that allows you to thread through a 4-pin pulse width modulated fan cable through, which means that you get that much tidier cable management in this case when you're putting something together. Rosewill, take a look at how this motherboard tray is structured right here and see if there's a way to maybe broaden that opening just a little bit to allow 2 fan cables to go through back here. If you can get 2 fan cables going through here, that would be such an amazing feature to add for someone like me who's extremely anal about cable management. Frankly, I love that happy accident exists in the first place. Probably the only other thing that actually ground my gears with this case was the front fans. Now, it uses 4 long shank screws in order to fasten a fan to the front of the case here, and you must use that style of screw because of how the fan openings are set up. The problem with that is there are only 4 of those screws included in the case. Again, this was a cost-saving measure, and yes, you could mount a second fan up front if you wanted to by just using 2 of the screws on each fan. But it's a weird compromise to have to make, and I'm a little disappointed in specifically that aspect of the case. Now, that being said, if you happen to have something like an all-in-one water cooler that has extra long thread screws, I found that my Cooler Master screws were actually able to work in these front threads with no problem. So, again, it is easy to find fasteners for this, but I really don't feel like the builder should have to make that kind of compromise specifically. But really, that's the only major gripe that I had with this case. So, I mean, really, all things considered, for a $50 chassis, I can absolutely forgive that. But yeah, you otherwise get an extremely clean layout on the interior of the case here. Even despite there not being any cable grommets on any of the openings here, you still have enough room to do all of the cable management in the rear that you can get a remarkably clean looking build in here. Now, speaking of cable management, the cable management that you're capable of in this case is nothing short of surprising in my case. Ignore the rat's nest of cables that are down here. That was all from the fact that this motherboard that I used for the reference build here has really poor fan header layout. But on a more traditional motherboard with headers that go along the side here, or that are closer to this side of the motherboard, you'll be able to get some extremely clean cable routing going here. And there's a ton of room back here. I can fit my finger almost entirely into the gap back here behind the motherboard tray, even at the shallowest point right here. Because of the bulge that's in the side panel, you still get room to mount something like one of those SwiftTech pulse width modulated fan hubs back here. So even if your motherboard did have a poor layout like this, you could still get all of your fan cables routed to a single location and have just one header on your motherboard running everything. This is something that's a little bit more expensive to implement than what most people would be building in a case like this, but the option is there. And that pretty well leads me into the conclusion with this case. So, what do I think about the Rosewill Tyrfing? Well, after my build experience with it, really... Okay, guys, it's a $50 case. It has a great side panel window on the side of it that lets you admire the interior of your build, which in this case comes together extremely clean. It's very straightforward. There were very few corners cut, and the corners that were cut, honestly, at this price point, I can wholeheartedly justify. The other thing here is this is one of the most forward-thinking entry-level cases I think I've ever seen. Personally, that is. Now, what do I mean by forward-thinking? Well, I mean it gives the entirety of your computer an upgrade path. Because of your accommodation that you get up here for up to a 360mm water cooling radiator, plus the fact that you could still technically mount a 120 in the rear, you have here the makings of a case that will grow as your system requirements need to grow as well. And by the time you need to replace this case, you will have been capable of putting some pretty decently high-end hardware in here. And it'll still show cleanly, and it'll still look like a well put together system. I mean, I have a hard time giving this case a poor recommendation, even in spite of some of the little gripes that I had with some of the supplied hardware. I mean, most of those fasteners are extremely easy to find, and even if you can't find them yourself, it's very easy to work around, and really all of the supplied components here will get the job done for you. Again, I would have really liked them to included more of the screws for the front of the case here, so that you can more securely mount your fans, but in the grand scheme of things, there are worse things that have been done to cases, and frankly, I feel like the package as a whole here, Rosewill did a fantastic job of supplying us with a $50 case that actually looks appealing and actually looks the part. So in my opinion, this definitely gets a thumbs up from me. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Have any of you had any experiences with some of the lower cost Rosewill options, and were they good or bad? Also, does this look like the right direction that people should be going with a low cost case? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Also, what kind of build would you throw together in something like this to give you the best upgrade path possible? Because that's really the key to building in something like this, right? Is having the most upgradability in mind. But with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and get the heck on out of here. You guys remember, do that thumbs up, thumbs down, share and subscribe thing like you do, how you do. And as always, I will catch you guys in the next video. Take it easy, YouTube.